Consider this analogy. The serial killer who murders indiscriminately over the course of many years and cannot be located or stopped. Case in point, I will use John Wayne Gacy. Gacy began killing around, we believe, 74 through 79. For more than 6 years of killing all young men from whom he solicited sexual acts. And never got caught. It is widely held today by many in the psychology field that serial killing and sexual deviance are intrinsically related. So for the fact that Gacy was killing young men and was obviously plagued by his own homosexual desire nature that he could not resolve is not in fact the reason he could commit serial murder for so many over such a long period of time and never get caught. The sexual link that he was a repressed homosexual and could not accept that he was, of course, easily discovered just from what Gacy had later told investigators after his arrest. This may very well have been part of why he committed the murders. It is not by any means the reason he was able to commit and continue to get away with it for so long. In addition to that mind or conscience he possessed, needs more than that to commit murder, repeatedly no less, and again for so long. This is, of course, my first point. To the premise of irrationality of the conscious unique to Gacy himself. I would venture to guess and to postulate that it works the very same way with anyone who commits serial murder. Again, we need to understand that this is not about the investigators unable to discover his identity, presumably because serial killing is unique in the fact that it occurs randomly without clear-cut connections from victim to victim, and therefore the motive is completely lacking for the investigators. Any other type of murder is almost always a conviction, and people are caught because investigators always try to establish motive first, and usually they can and find one, so the perpetrator is then easily discovered. In many murder cases, you have other evidence that can be collected from the body or the crime scene itself that leads to suspects and finally eyewitness accounts of hearing something or seeing something at some point in time. However, unique to serial killing, most of this evidence is generally unavailable. It is simply absent, but again, there is a reason for this, and it is definitely not just because the victims are unrelated and cannot often be connected in time and space in relationship to a common individual. In case of Gacy, we have an additional problem that presents investigators at odds to work with, and not simply because they cannot connect the victims. The boys are nowhere to be found, so for a long period, the police are not investigating murders but missing persons. It seems quite clear that it is occurring, but for at least 3 years they could not make the case for murder collectively on the missing persons because without a body you have no crime to investigate. All they really knew is that these men seemed to be missing, so after 3 years they began to establish a link, a common denominator between the missing men. At some point much later, Gacy begins to develop a problem. After he would kill his victims, he would carefully bring their bodies beneath the floor paneling of his kitchen and try to bury them. After some time, some 38 dead rotting corpses, not embalmed or drained of the fluid in their bodies, the smell began to rapidly escalate into a very serious problem. At first, his neighbor confronts him about the odor, and Gacy explains he is aware of it, but he assures the man that he will stop the smell because he understands what the cause is, and he was already at work working on it. Now, what does this say about Gacy's mind or conscience? Does it mean that confronted with the neighbor's rational argument about the smell is enough to stop the killings? No. Why? Because, like I said, he is killing for a reason, and there may be more than one, even at all, can be valid reasons to kill. There may be more than one, even, and all can be valid reasons to kill, even though that in itself would be unreasonable to a reasonable person, but in of itself is not irrational. First of all, we have not established if Gacy is or is not reasonable, for at first glance he appears to be doing reasonable things. When confronted with his neighbor's complaint about the ever-present putrid, acrid smell that is obviously coming from under his house, he reasonably explains why, and he has a plan of action already underway to fix it. that is definitely a reasonable response. Does he now stop serial killing? No, to the contrary, he continues unabated, all the while attempting to fill the undergirder of the house with cement and lime in attempts to stop the odor. But the action is reasonable because if he cannot stop the odor, he may very well get caught, right? The attempt to stop the odor is clearly enough to support that his consciousness is rational in the sense that because the attempt to cover the smell says something about Gacy's own mind. This is where it gets a little bit confusing and shows how complex our consciousness is. At the same time, it can be irrational on the basis, but completely irrational on another. But this is the only thing that will stop the killing because by now the investigators suspect he is involved. They have made clear connections to the various missing men and began to stake out his house, parked across the street under 24-hour surveillance, watching him every day. Does he stop? Does he stop? Does he get caught? No. Why? Because this is not about anything other than the mind of Gacy himself. Okay, why? Because this is not about anything other than the mind of Gacy himself. Okay, look at this. His attempts to cover the smell are reasonable because obviously he is aware that he may get caught. Not the killings, the smell. So what does this imply? What does this imply? Gacy knows on a rational level that other people, the police, the law, forbid you to kill. He clearly knows such is the reason he attempts to cover the smell. But even with the police watching him round the clock, he continues to kill and get away with it even under the nose of the police. Now we come to the irrational part of his mind that knows rationally killing is unacceptable and he doesn't want to get caught, but this is the only rational to the extent that other people feel to be true, not to him. In his own mind, there can be only but one thing that under these circumstances could permit him to continue to kill and not get caught. What is it? His mind did not somehow lose conscience, but he has come to believe that killing is okay. Otherwise, why bother to cover up the smell? This alone suggests he's aware that what he is doing is not okay, and he knows that, but still, to his own mind, the concern is only that others don't agree that killing is okay. In his conscience, he has not lost anything. He has simply provided himself the permission to kill. We may never know what that was, but from the totality of everything going on at this point, his mind is still fully okay with committing murder. His conscious mind has somehow been persuaded that only other people and the law say killing is not acceptable, but his consciousness in himself has completely irrationally convinced him that he does not have an issue with killing. It's just other people do. The killing continues still because that belief system he has somehow created is so absolutely okay with this activity that nothing will stop the killing. The police at the very end could not catch him under 24-hour surveillance. Why? Because it's only about the own mind that can stop this. As the smell continues unabated and the police now fully convinced to secure a warrant to get into the house and under the floor to examine what's there, he would routinely bring them donuts and coffee in an effort to manipulate and ingratiate himself to them as a means of trying to deliberately act as though he had nothing to hide. Interestingly enough, it was the night before that Gacy himself invites the police investigators over to his house to prepare a meal for them, as he has become friendly with them all the while they are watching him across the street. They accepted the offer, of course, and once in the house, one of the officers complained of the ever-present putrid smell coming from beneath the kitchen floor. As soon as he becomes aware of that fact, the smell will not go, no matter what efforts he continues to make it. Was the very day he goes to his best friend and tells him he thinks he has been doing something wrong. Get it? He just says he believes he may be doing something wrong. That was the moment the investigators got the warrant and entered the home later that day before Gacy returned and pulled up the kitchen floor. The point in all this is the moment his mind just simply thinks he may be doing something wrong, the whole thing is over. That's all. It required his mind that's all. That's all it required. His mind had to finally admit that he might be wrong. Just that much is all it took. One single moment of doubt in his own consciousness that everything is over. It was in fact, the very same moment he was confessing to his friend that the police secured the warrant immediately after he confessed, and either Gacy or the police had any idea that the two things, Gacy's confession and doubt, or the police independently securing the warrant, moments after he did this, knew each other. Indeed, the police didn't even know where he had gone that day nor what he had told his friend. It just so happened that, according to police reports, Gacy makes his confession to his friend around 10 a.m. and the police secured the warrant around 3 p.m. Neither of them knew what was the other doing. This was nothing to do with good police work, but only the mind of Gacy himself that had no longer the capacity to believe irrationally, of course, that killing was okay. So with this analogy, we may now have a clear impression of what it is or is not rational, and moreover that this is a fundamental element to the construction of a different belief system. Most importantly, it conveys a singular duplicity in belief systems of all forms and shapes. Even critical absolutes are unsustainable because the subjective element within its construct will render it irrational, spurious at best, and fallacious at worst. Irreducibly compartmentalized to its many constituent parts, that alone by themselves cannot fail to remain altogether subjective or irrational.